Alistair woke to the metallic taste of blood and the sharp scent of pine. His head throbbed with a rhythm like a hammer striking an anvil, a jagged reminder of the falling timbers and the suffocating pressure of the smoke. For a moment, his mind was back in the manor's burning corridor, the air thick with the muffled shouts of men who meant to see him dead. Then, the ceiling came into focus, not the gilded frescoes of his bedroom, but rough-hewn timber and the dancing shadows of a dying fire. He tried to shift, but a bolt of agony flared in his side, forcing a ragged groan from his lips. "Don't move," a voice commanded. It was quiet and steady. Alistair turned his head slowly. A woman sat near the hearth, the firelight carving her features in gold. She was washing a cloth in a small basin, her movements methodical. She was soot-stained and her dress was plain, but her eyes held a fierce, watchful light. She was not one of his staff, nor was she one of the men who had struck him down. "Where am I?" Alistair managed to rasp, his throat feeling as though he had swallowed ash. "In a woodcutter's cabin," she replied. "The manor is a ruin on the horizon. I pulled you from the courtyard before the roof collapsed." The memory hit him then, a cold wave that chilled his fever. The twins. He tried to bolt upright, but the world tilted, and he gasped as his stitches pulled. "Aiden? Isla, where are they?" "They are safe," she said, her voice softening. She gestured to a wooden crate. "They are sleeping. Fed and warm." Alistair sank back, the air leaving his lungs in a shaky breath. He looked at her then, truly looked. He saw the callus on her hands and the way she sat, like someone used to guarding a threshold. He was a man accustomed to power, yet here, he was a broken body dependent on the mercy of a stranger who knew nothing of his name. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hardening with the instinctive caution of a man whose own blood had turned against him. "Elara Donovan," she said simply. "And I don't know your name, but men who travel with infants and wear rings of gold don't usually end up left for dead in a burning courtyard by accident." Silence settled between them. Elara watched him, her mind weighing the danger he represented. She had saved him, but she could see the restrained intensity in his gaze, a hardness that suggested he was as dangerous as the men who had hunted him. As the wind rattled the door, Alistair realized he was no longer a duke in this room, he was a man in the dark, and Elara was the only thing standing between his family and the cold. The smoke followed Elara like a persistent ghost, clinging to the wool of her cloak and the damp strands of hair plastered to her forehead. Behind her, the horizon was still stained with the orange-red bruise of the burning citadel, but ahead lay only the suffocating embrace of the Blackwood. Every snap of a twig under her boots sounded like a bone breaking, a roar of discovery in the oppressive silence of the forest. She didn't dare stop, even when her lungs felt as though they were filled with the very air she was fleeing. Pressed against her chest, the weight of the bundle felt impossibly heavy and terrifyingly light all at once. The two infants had been unnaturally silent since she had snatched them from the silken cradle as the first stones began to fall. It was a silence born of shock, or perhaps something more ancient, but it chilled her more than the biting mountain air. As the trees began to thin near the base of a jagged granite cliff, Elara saw it, the silhouette of the cabin. It was a humble thing, overgrown with silver-leafed ivy and tucked so deeply into the shadow of the rock that one might pass it a dozen times without noticing. It was the place her father had spoken of in whispers, a sanctuary for a rainy day. This was a deluge of blood and fire, and the cabin was all that remained. She stumbled through the door, her knees finally giving way the moment the heavy oak bolt slid home. The interior was cold, smelling of dried herbs and old cedar. For a long minute, she simply knelt on the floor, gasping for breath, listening to the frantic rhythm of her own heart. "Safe," she whispered, the word cracking in her throat. "You're safe." With trembling hands, she moved to the small wooden table in the center of the room and carefully laid the bundle down. The light was dim, filtered through the thick glass of a single circular window, but as she peeled back the scorched layers of fine Kyrosian linen, a soft radiance began to fill the room. It didn't come from the dying sun outside. Elara froze. The infants were awake now, their eyes wide and impossibly clear. They weren't crying. Instead, they watched her with a terrifying, serene intelligence. As she pulled the fabric away entirely, she saw the source of the glow. On the chest of each child, just above the heart, was a mark that hadn't been there when she had scooped them up in the chaos. It was a shimmering, iridescent sigil, a twin-headed phoenix entwined with a jagged lightning bolt. The color drained from Elara's face. She fell back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry of realization. She had thought she was saving the children of a minor noble, a task assigned to her as a lowly nursery maid in the confusion of the siege. But the marks told a far more dangerous story. These were not the children of a duke or a lord. The twin-headed phoenix was the mark of the Aethelgard, the bloodline of the primordial kings, a lineage thought to have been extinguished 3 centuries ago. The legends were clear, the Aethelgard did not just rule by right of crown, but by right of the realm's soul. They were the anchors of the world's magic, the only ones capable of wielding the great ember that kept the shadows of the void at bay. If these children lived, the current usurper's throne was a house of cards. If they lived, the very fabric of the realm would begin to shift back toward its true north. Elara looked from the glowing marks to the small, fragile faces of the babes. They weren't just orphans of a fallen city. They were the heirs to the realm's greatest power, a power that kings would burn entire continents to possess or destroy. The weight of her responsibility shifted then, moving from the simple instinct of a survivor to the crushing gravity of a guardian. She was no longer just a girl running from a fire. She was the only thing standing between the last embers of a divine dynasty and the cold wind of an empire built on lies. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, sounding like the distant hunt of 1,000 soldiers. Inside, the cabin grew warm, bathed in the soft, golden pulse of the sleeping heirs. Elara reached out, her fingers hovering just inches above the shimmering marks, and felt a hum of energy that vibrated in her very marrow. The world thought the Aethelgard were a myth, a ghost of a golden age. They were wrong. The golden age was breathing on a cedar table in the middle of a dark forest, and Elara was the only one left to keep the fire from going out. The gold of the infant sigils had faded into a dull, dormant amber, but the heat of the secret still scorched Elara's palms. She had covered them hastily, wrapping the babes in coarse, moth-eaten wool blankets she found in a cedar chest, hiding the royal linen beneath the floorboards. But they weren't the only burden she had carried into the sanctuary of the Blackwood. In the corner of the room, draped across a low rope bed, lay a man who looked like a fallen god of war. Alistair, the Duke of Oakhaven, moved his head with a low, guttural groan that vibrated through the small cabin. Elara flinched, her hand instinctively flying to the hilt of the small skinning knife she had placed on the table. She had dragged him through the threshold by the straps of his scorched breastplate, a feat of adrenaline-fueled strength she could no longer fathom now that her muscles were turning to lead. The fire she had managed to coax to life in the hearth cast long, dancing shadows across his face. He was pale, the blood from a deep gash on his temple having dried into a dark crust that matted his golden hair. Without his horse, his sword, or his retinue of knights, he looked smaller, dangerously human. Alistair's eyes snapped open. They were the color of a winter sea, turbulent and disoriented. For a heartbeat, he didn't know her. He lunged upward, a soldier's instinct overriding the trauma to his body, but his breath hitched in a jagged gasp and he fell back against the furs, his hand clutching his side where the armor was dented inward. "Easy, my lord," Elara said, her voice a fragile thread in the silence. She stayed by the table, keeping the bulk of it between them. Alistair's gaze darted around the room, taking in the low beams, the bundles of drying sage, and finally, the 2 small bundles resting in the makeshift cradle of a laundry basket. Memory seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening until the bone leapt beneath the skin. "The Citadel," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stone. "The fire, the shadows in the courtyard." "Gone," Elara replied. "We are in the Blackwood. Far from the walls." He turned his head toward her, his focus sharpening. You were in the nursery. You're the girl who ran. I'm the girl who didn't die, she corrected him, her courage flickering like the hearth fire. And I'm the girl who pulled you out of the rubble when the eastern tower collapsed. Alistair struggled into a sitting position, ignoring the fresh blossom of red staining the bandages she had applied while he was unconscious. He looked at the children, his expression unreadable. Elara held her breath. Did he know? Did he see the marks before she covered them? As a Duke of the High Council, he was closer to the throne than almost anyone. If he was a loyalist to the usurper, he would see these infants as a threat to be extinguished. If he was a man of the old world, he might see them as a hope he wasn't ready to carry. Why save me, Elara? He asked softly. He didn't use her title or call her girl. He used the name he must have heard the other servants whisper in the halls. You had the children. You could have moved faster without a dying man anchored to your heels. I don't know, she lied. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. She was afraid to be alone with the weight of the realm's future. She needed a sword, even a broken one. You fought the shadows. I saw you. The usurper's men, they weren't human. You stood against them. Alistair looked down at his trembling hands. And I failed. I watched the city burn. I watched the king fall. The king is dead. Elara whispered, the confirmation feeling like a final door slamming shut. There is no one left, Alistair said, his voice hollow. He looked toward the infants again, and for a fleeting second, Elara saw a flash of something, not greed, but a profound, aching recognition. He started to reach out a hand toward the basket, but Elara stepped forward, her movement sharp and defensive. He froze, his hand suspended in the air. He looked up at her, seeing the knife on the table and the fierce, protective glow in her eyes. A slow, grim smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. You have the heart of a lioness, little bird, he murmured. But you are right to be wary. In this world, trust is a swifter killer than any blade. He sank back into the bed, his strength spent. I am Alistair of Oakhaven. My lands are ash. My men are ghosts. I have nothing left but my name and a debt to the girl who refused to let me rot in the ruins. Elara watched him, searching for the lie. She saw only the exhaustion of a man who had lost everything. But she kept the wool blankets tucked tightly around the infants, hiding the shimmering phoenixes from his sight. She wasn't ready to reveal the truth, not until she knew if the Duke was a man who served the light, or a man who would trade it for a seat at the usurper's table. Outside, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that seemed to pull the walls of the cabin tighter around them. The darkness was vast, and the fire was small, but for now, it was enough. The rain began as a rhythmic drumming against the cabin's thatched roof before turning into a freezing sleet that encased the Blackwood in a sheath of glass. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of boiled vinegar, crushed yarrow, and the cloyingly sweet metallic tang of a wound gone sour. Alistair was no longer the stoic Duke who had watched Elara with wary sea-colored eyes. He was a man drowning on dry land. His skin had taken on a waxen, yellowed hue, and a frantic heat radiated from him, warming the small corner of the room where he lay tangled in sweat-drenched furs. Elara moved between the hearth and the bed with the mechanical grace of the exhausted. She had spent the last few hours tearing strips of her own shift to create fresh bandages, her fingers raw from wringing out hot compresses. Every few minutes, she glanced at the laundry basket. The airs were unnaturally still, their breathing so soft she had to check the rise of their chests to be sure they were still with her. They seemed to sense the encroaching darkness, their golden eyes tracking her movements through the gloom of the cabin. Alistair's hand suddenly shot out, catching Elara's wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong despite his state. His knuckles were white, and his eyes, though clouded with fever, were wide with a terrifying clarity. He held the torch, Alistair hissed, the words bubbling up through a throat constricted by pain. It wasn't the enemy at the gates. It was the hand that held the key. Elara froze, the bowl of herbal wash trembling in her free hand. She leaned closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who, my lord? Who lit the fire? Alistair's head thrashed against the pillow, his gaze fixed on some horror only he could see in the rafters. Vane. The Chancellor. He opened the postern gate. I saw him, Elara. He stood among the shadows, smiling as the nursery wing collapsed. He didn't want a conquest. He wanted an execution. The name felt like a physical weight dropping into the small room. Chancellor Vane had been the king's most trusted advisor, the man who had overseen the very treasury that paid Elara's meager wages. If the betrayal came from the heart of the court, then there was no city to return to, no garrison that could be trusted. They were truly alone. He's looking for them, Alistair whispered, his voice dropping to a jagged rasp. He knows the bloodline didn't end with the king. He'll hunt the scent of the Aethelgard until the world ends. He slumped back, the strength leaving him as quickly as it had come. His hand slid from her wrist, leaving behind red marks on her skin. In the silence that followed, Elara felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. The Duke's revelation stripped away the last of her hope for a rescue, but it replaced it with something sturdier, a grim, shared destiny. She looked at this broken man, a high-born lord who had lost his honor, his home, and very nearly his life to a traitor's greed. He was no longer a stranger to be feared, he was the only other living soul who knew the weight of the burden she carried. She sat on the edge of the bed and dipped a cloth into the cool water, gently wiping the salt and grime from his brow. She didn't speak, but as she worked, the tension that had hummed between them since they arrived began to dissolve. It was a silent pact, forged in the shadow of a fever. She would keep him alive, and in return, he would be the shield these children required. Throughout the long, frozen night, the Duke's fever broke and peaked like a storm at sea. Whenever he drifted near the edge of consciousness, Elara was there, a steady shadow in the firelight. She fed him spoonfuls of bitter broth and sang low, wordless melodies that she remembered from her own childhood, tunes that seemed to suit the infants as much as the man. By the time the first grey light of dawn filtered through the ice-crusted window, Alistair's breathing had leveled out. The red streaks of infection that had begun to climb his arm had retreated, halted by her frantic ministrations. He opened his eyes, and this time, there was no fog of delirium. He looked at Elara, really looked at her, noticing the soot on her cheeks, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the quiet ferocity with which she held her ground. He reached out, his fingers brushing the back of her hand as she reached for a discarded bandage. It wasn't a gesture of command or even of gratitude, it was an acknowledgement of an equal. The fire didn't take everything, he said softly, his voice weak but steady. Elara met his gaze, her jaw setting in a line of iron. No. It left us. The bond was sealed then, without an oath or a signature. In the quiet of the hidden cabin, surrounded by the remnants of a fallen world, a servant and a duke became the first architects of a resistance they had not yet named. The infants in the basket stirred, a faint, golden pulse flickering beneath their blankets, as if responding to the shift in the air. The brittle silence of the frozen forest was not broken by a shout or a crash, but by the soft, rhythmic snick of metal sliding against leather. Elara sat bolt upright on her pallet of straw, her heart instantly leaping into her throat. The fire in the hearth had died down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a hellish, low-slung crimson light across the cabin floor. Beside her, the laundry basket was a hump of shadow, the infants within perfectly, terrifyingly still. Across the room, Alistair had also stirred. He didn't rise, his body was still a prison of fever-weakened muscle, but Elara could see the glint of his eyes in the dark. He looked toward the door, his face a mask of concentrated agony as he tried to force his limbs to obey. Elara, he breathed, the sound so faint it was almost lost to the wind. The rafters. She didn't look up, but she understood. There was a draft where there shouldn't be one. Someone had removed a piece of the thatch, slipping into the crawl space above with the silence of a hunting owl. The assassin dropped with a muffled thud, landing between the door and the table. He was a creature of the dark, clad in black and boiled leather that didn't reflect the dying firelight. A thin, curved blade, a widowmaker, used by the Chancellor's personal scouts, glowed dull silver in his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a villainous boast. He simply turned his head toward the laundry basket and began to move. Elara's world narrowed to the space between her and the killer. She was not a knight, she had no training in the arts of death. But as the man took a step toward the children, a cold, white-hot vacuum opened in her chest, swallowing her fear. She lunged. She didn't go for the man's throat, she wasn't tall enough. Instead, she threw her entire weight into his knees, screaming a raw, wordless sound of defiance. The assassin, caught off guard by the sheer desperation of a servant girl, stumbled back. His blade hissed through the air, slicing the shoulder of Elara's tunic and drawing a thin line of fire across her skin. "Stay away from them," she shrieked, scrambling up and grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. The assassin recovered with predatory grace, his eyes cold and unimpressed. He shifted his weight, preparing to dispatch her with a single, efficient thrust. "Enough," a voice rasped from the corner. Alistair had dragged himself halfway off the bed. He looked like a ghost of the man he had been, his face ghastly pale and slick with sweat, but he held a heavy ceramic pitcher in his hand. With a guttural roar of effort, he hurled it. It didn't hit the assassin, but it shattered against the wall behind him, the spray of water and shards momentarily distracting the killer. It was the heartbeat of a second Elara needed. She didn't swing the poker like a club, she thrust it forward like a spear, the glowing red tip catching the assassin in the soft meat of his thigh. He let out a choked hiss of pain, his leg buckling. As he fell, Elara didn't hesitate. She dropped the iron and threw herself onto the table, grabbing the small skinning knife she had kept hidden beneath a cloth. The struggle was a blur of shadows and frantic breath. The assassin was stronger, but Elara was fighting for the only light left in a dark world. They rolled across the floor, the man's gloved hand catching her throat, his fingers squeezing. Black spots danced in Elara's vision. She could feel the heat of the twins' presence behind her, the golden pulse of their bloodline humming in the air like a warning. With her last ounce of strength, she drove the skinning knife upward. The assassin stiffened. His grip on her throat slackened, his breath hitching in a wet, rattling sound. He slumped forward, his weight pinning her to the floorboards. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the embers and Elara's own sobbing gasps for air. She pushed the body off her, her hands shaking so violently she had to tuck them under her arms. She looked at Alistair, who had collapsed back onto the bed, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of horror and profound respect. "You're hurt," he managed to say, gesturing to her shoulder. "I'm alive," Elara whispered. She crawled over to the laundry basket, her knees scraping the wood. She pulled back the wool blanket. The infants were awake. Their golden eyes were glowing with an intensity she had never seen before, a soft radiance that seemed to push back the very shadows the assassin had brought with him. They weren't crying, they were watching her, their tiny hands reaching out as if to touch the blood on her face. The realization hit her then, heavier than the assassin's body. The sanctuary was gone. If one scout had found them, others would follow the trail. The Blackwood was no longer a shield, it was a cage. "We have to leave," Elara said, her voice turning from a whisper to a hard, brittle command. She looked at Alistair, seeing the way his wounds had reopened, the blood soaking through his fresh bandages. "We have to leave now." Alistair nodded, his jaws set in a grim line of survival. "He'll have horses nearby. A scout wouldn't hunt this deep on foot." Elara stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the dead man on her floor, then at the glowing heirs of a fallen empire. She was no longer the girl who had run from the fire. The fire was inside her now. The cold air of the pre-dawn was a physical weight, pressing against the lungs as Elara and Alistair moved through the skeletal trees. The assassin's horse, a sturdy, dark-coated stallion found tethered half a mile from the cabin, snorted a plume of white steam into the grey light. Alistair held the reins with a hand that no longer trembled. The fever had left him as abruptly as a summer storm, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus that seemed to knit his broken ribs back together with sheer, aristocratic will. He stood taller now, the slump of the wounded man vanished, replaced by the rigid, terrifying posture of a commander. He had found his cloak, a heavy, fur-lined mantle of deep emerald, among the scout's gear, and as he draped it over his shoulders, the transformation was complete. He was no longer the dying soldier Elara had dragged through the mud, he was the Duke of Oakhaven, and the cabin's intimacy was dying with the rising sun. "We cannot stay on the main trails," Alistair said, his voice stripped of its earlier rasp. It was a voice used to being obeyed by hundreds, a voice that carried the weight of stone walls and iron laws. "Vane will have signaled the border garrisons. They will be looking for a girl and a wounded man. They will not be looking for the High Warden of the Marches." Elara, who was busy securing the laundry basket to a makeshift sling across her chest, paused. The title he had used wasn't just a courtesy. In the Citadel, the High Warden was a figure of legend, the man who held the keys to the kingdom's deepest armories and the loyalty of the elite iron-bound. "High Warden," she whispered, the words feeling heavy and foreign on her tongue. "I thought you were simply a Duke of the Council." Alistair turned to her, and for the first time, the distance between them felt like a physical chasm. The flickering warmth of the cabin, the shared soup, the way his hand had brushed hers in the dark, it all felt like a fevered dream that had evaporated in the frost. He looked at her not as a savior, but as a subject. "Oakhaven is not merely a title of land, Elara," he said, his eyes reflecting the steel grey of the morning sky. "My blood is bound to the Aethelgard by an oath older than the Citadel itself. I am the king's shadow, his first shield and his final blade. If the heirs live, I am the regent of the realm by ancient decree. Every night from here to the Sunspear is mine to command, should I reach them." He stepped toward her, and Elara instinctively took a step back. The shift in his aura was suffocating. The vulnerability she had tended to was gone, replaced by a power so ancient and entrenched that it made her feel smaller than she ever had in the palace kitchens. She was a girl who knew the names of herbs and the way to soothe a crying babe. He was a man who moved the pieces of the world. "You speak as if the war is already won," Elara said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "But we are still 3 people and 2 infants hiding in a forest of ghosts." "The war began the moment you chose to stay in that nursery," Alistair countered. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near the basket where the twins slept. "You have done the impossible, Elara. You have preserved the light. But you must understand that the path ahead requires more than just kindness. It requires authority. It requires a name that can rally an army." He looked at her then, his gaze softening only slightly, but the shadow of his status remained. "You saved a man, but you must now follow a lord. There are rules to this, protocols that will protect the children and you. When we reach the loyalist camps, you will be my ward. It is the only way to explain your presence without revealing who you truly are." "And who am I?" Elara asked, a sudden spark of bitterness rising in her chest. "A hero," he said simply. "But in the eyes of the court, you are a commoner who has touched the divine. That is a dangerous thing to be." The gap between them yawned wide. Elara looked down at her stained apron, her cracked fingernails, and the rough wool of her cloak. She had bled for these children. She had killed for them. Yet, in the world Alistair was reconstructing with every word, she was a footnote, a temporary guardian to be categorized and managed. The wheel they had built in the cabin was fracturing into him and her, into lord and servant. She realized then that the danger didn't just come from the Chancellor's scouts. It came from the very structure of the world they were trying to save. To Alistair, the heirs were a cause, a crown, and a bloodline. To her, they were 2 small lives that smelled of milk and needed warmth. Alistair mounted the horse with a fluid, practiced motion, reaching down to offer her his hand. It was a gesture of protection, but to Elara, it felt like the closing of a cage. She looked at his hand, then up at his face, seeing the Duke of Oakhaven in full, terrifying clarity. "Come," he commanded, though he tried to soften it with a nod. "The sun is up, and the shadows are hunting." Elara took his hand, the leather of his glove cold against her skin, and allowed him to pull her up behind him. As they trotted away from the hidden cabin, she looked back once. The small sanctuary was already disappearing into the mist, and with it, the version of Elara that was Alistair's equal. She held the infants tighter against her heart, wondering if, in the world he intended to build, there would be any room left for a girl who only knew how to love them. The derelict priory at the edge of the marches was a skeleton of grey stone, its roof long since surrendered to the winter wind, but the crypts beneath remained dry and hidden. It was here, in the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle, that Alistair finished buckling his greaves. The metallic click of the fastenings echoed against the vaulted ceiling like the ticking of a clock, counting down the final minutes of their shared isolation. He looked every bit the High Warden now. The soot of the fire and the pallor of the fever had been scrubbed away, replaced by the cold, polished steel of his station. He moved with a predatory grace that made the small space feel even more cramped, his presence expanding to fill the stone chamber until Elara felt she was breathing the very air he discarded. "I cannot rally the lords from a hole in the earth, Elara," he said, his voice resonant and stripped of the vulnerability that had bound them in the Blackwood. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his focus was fixed on the heavy signet ring he was sliding back onto his finger. Vane is already weaving his narrative. If I do not appear in the capital to reclaim my seat and challenge his regency, the window for a bloodless coup will slam shut. I must be the Duke of Oakhaven before I can be the shield for these children. Elara sat on a stone bench, the laundry basket nestled at her feet. She felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest, as if a part of her was being hollowed out to make room for the silence he would leave behind. In the cabin, they had been two survivors against the dark. Here, as he prepared to step back into the light of his own power, she was reminded of exactly where she stood, in the shadows, waiting for his return. "And if you don't return?" she asked, the question barely a whisper. Alistair paused, his hand resting on the hilt of the broadsword he had reclaimed from a loyalist cache. He turned to her then, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the High Warden slipped. The Wintersea eyes softened, catching the light of the candle with a look of profound, aching conflict. He stepped across the small space and knelt before her, not as a lord to a subject, but as the man she had pulled from the wreckage. "I will return," he promised, his voice dropping to a low, intense vibrato. He reached out, his gloved thumb brushing the line of her jaw. The leather was cold, but the heat of his gaze was staggering. "The world is breaking, Lara, but I will not let it break you. Stay hidden. Trust no one who does not carry my seal. If the moon turns twice and I have not sent word, take the children and go to the coast. There are those in the islands who still remember the phoenix." He stood up abruptly, as if the proximity were a weakness he could no longer afford. With a final, sharp nod, he turned and ascended the stone stairs, his heavy cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a dark bird. The iron-bound door at the top of the stairs groaned open, admitting a momentary rush of freezing air and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk, before it slammed shut with a finality that made the candle flame dance and die. The silence that followed was absolute. Elara remained still for a long time, her hands folded in her lap. The absence of him was not merely the loss of a protector, it was the loss of the only person who truly knew what she had done, and what she was becoming. She looked at the infants, who were stirring in their sleep, their tiny breaths rhythmic and fragile. In the darkness of the crypt, the golden sigils on their chests didn't glow, they were just shadows against the wall, waiting for the spark that only their blood could provide. She stood up and began the quiet, repetitive tasks of survival, tending the small brazier, checking the seals on the water skins, and ensuring the children were warm. But as the hours stretched into the first long, lonely night, the priory felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. Every drip of water from the ceiling, every scuttle of a mouse in the corner, felt magnified. she found herself gravitating toward the spot where he had knelt. She reached out and touched the cold stone, her fingers tracing the place where his boots had rested. It was a quiet, sharp ache, a realization that she had grown accustomed to the sound of his breathing and the weight of his presence. Without him, the gravity of her task felt heavier, a mountain of responsibility she had to carry alone through the dark. She was the guardian of the realm's future, tucked away in a hole in the ground, while the man she had saved rode toward a den of lions. Elara wrapped her arms around herself, pulling her cloak tight, and settled into wait. The night was long, and the silence was a cold companion, but as she looked at the sleeping heirs, she knew that the fire she had saved was worth every moment of loneliness. The silence of the priory was not broken by a single horseman this time, but by the rhythmic, thunderous pulse of a cavalry troop. Elara stood in the center of the crypt, her hand hovering over the laundry basket, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The iron-bound door at the top of the stairs groaned open, and for a moment, the grey winter light was so blinding it washed out the world. Then, a silhouette appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in the heavy, unmistakable weight of authority. He didn't come alone. Behind him, the clatter of armored boots on stone sounded like a falling mountain. Alistair descended the stairs with a grace that was no longer feline and cautious, but heraldic. He wore a breastplate of polished black steel inlaid with silver filigree, the blackthorn armor of his ancestors. A white surcoat, pristine and untouched by the grime of the road, bore the oak and iron crest of his house. His face was clean-shaven, his golden hair swept back, and his eyes, the winter-sea eyes that had once looked at her with desperate vulnerability, were now as cool and impenetrable as the stone walls around them. "My Lord Duke," a voice echoed from the stairs, a soldier, rigid and deferential. "The perimeter is secure. The carriage is prepared." Alistair didn't look at the soldier. He looked at Elara. But it wasn't the look of a man who had shared a bowl of thin broth in a freezing cabin. It was the look of a sovereign inspecting a vital asset. "Vane has been neutralized," Alistair said, his voice echoing with a newfound resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Elara's bones. "The council has acknowledged my regency. The capital is held by the Ironbound. The fire has been contained." "You did it," Elara whispered, her voice sounding small and ragged in the presence of so much steel. "We did it," he corrected, though the "we" felt different now. It sounded like a historical record, not a shared secret. He stepped toward her, and the soldiers at his back remained like statues, their gazes fixed forward, pointedly ignoring the girl in the stained wool cloak and the common laundry basket at her feet. Alistair reached out, taking Elara's hand. His grip was firm, but his leather glove felt like a barrier, a layer of status that hadn't existed when they were huddled together for warmth. He leaned in, his voice dropping just enough to exclude the men on the stairs. "The danger is not gone, Elara. It has simply changed shape. In the capital, you will be the nurse of the heirs. You will have rooms in the high tower. You will have silk and protection. And what will I be to you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Alistair's expression flickered, a brief, pained shadow of the man who had knelt in the dirt, but it was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by the mask of the High Warden. "You will be the woman who saved the realm. I will ensure you are honored. But you must understand, the court has eyes. They look for weakness in the bloodline. They look for reasons to doubt the regency." He stepped back, turning toward his men. "Secure the children. Ensure the mistress is escorted with the highest honors." Mistress. The word felt like a cold stone in her stomach. It was a title, yes, but it was a box. It was a way to categorize her, to strip away the girl who had killed an assassin with a fire poker and replace her with a figure of courtly convenience. As the soldiers stepped forward with a silken, cushioned palanquin to receive the heirs, Elara felt the chasm between their worlds open wide. She watched as Alistair gave orders, his movements precise and distant. He was no longer the man who needed her to stay alive, he was the man the world needed to stay stable. As she was ushered toward the waiting carriage, Surrounded by the clanking of silver-clad knights, she realized that the victory she had prayed for had come at a devastating cost. She had saved the Duke of Oakhaven, but in doing so, she had lost Alistair. The journey to the capital was a blur of high-walled roads and cheering crowds, but inside the carriage, Elara held the infants and felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The twins watched her with their glowing, ancient eyes, the only things that still felt real in a world that had suddenly become a stage. When they finally passed through the great gates of the Citadel, Alistair was at the head of the procession, his black armor gleaming under a pale sun. He didn't look back at the carriage. He didn't need to. He was back on his throne, and Elara was exactly where he needed her to be, tucked away in the shadows of his greatness, a silent witness to a story she was no longer allowed to tell. The high tower felt more like a tomb of ivory than a sanctuary. Silk hangings in shades of cream and gold dampened the sound of the wind, but they could not stifle the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the city below, a city that was now Alistair's to rule and Elara's to fear. Here, the twins were no longer tucked into a laundry basket, they lay in a cradle carved from weirwood, watched over by silent, armored sentries who stood outside the heavy oak doors. Elara sat by the hearth, the warmth of the fire failing to reach the chill that had settled in her bones since their arrival at the Citadel. She had been given gowns of fine wool and slippers of soft leather, yet she felt more like a ghost than ever, a relic of a journey that the court was already trying to erase. The door groaned on its hinges, and the sentries' spears clattered in a sharp, synchronized salute. Elara didn't need to turn to know who had entered. The air always seemed to sharpen when he was near, vibrating with the suppressed energy of a man who had spent the day battling vipers in silk robes. Alistair did not stop at the edge of the room. He shed his heavy, fur-lined mantle, tossing it onto a chair with a careless disregard that spoke of his mounting frustration. His doublet was unbuttoned at the throat, and for a moment, as he stood in the firelight, the Duke vanished, and the man from the cabin returned, exhausted, raw, and haunted. The council has spent 6 hours debating the merits of an alliance with House Valerius, Alistair said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He walked to the cradle, looking down at the sleeping heirs with a gaze that was uncharacteristically tender. They want me to take the Duchess Isabella to my bed to secure the southern marches. They see these children as pieces on a board, and they see me as the hand that must move them. Elara stood, her hands knotting in the fine fabric of her skirt. She is a high-born lady, my lord. She knows the dances of the court. She would be the shield you need against the Chancellor's remaining loyalists. Alistair turned, and the intensity in his eyes made Elara's breath catch. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping so close she could smell the scent of wind and cedar clinging to his clothes. Isabella Valerius did not pull me from the rubble. She did not hunt for yarrow in a frozen forest while an infection tried to take my life. She did not stand between a killer and the future of this realm with nothing but a fire poker and a scream. The world does not care about those things, Alistair, Elara whispered, the use of his name feeling like a transgression in the opulence of the tower. The world cares about bloodlines and legacies. I am a nursery maid who happened to be in the right place at the end of the world. You are the only person in this city who is real, he countered, his hand reaching out to catch hers. This time, he wasn't wearing his gloves. His skin was warm, his grip firm and desperate. They want me to marry a name to protect the throne. But I have realized that the throne is nothing without the light we found in that cabin. I don't want an alliance, Elara. I want a partner. He dropped to one knee, not with the practiced flourish of a courtier, but with the heavy, resounding thud of a man committing an act of war. The scandal of it seemed to ripple through the very stones of the tower. A High Warden, a regent of the Aethelgard, kneeling before a girl whose hands were still calloused from labor. Alistair, stand up, she pleaded, looking toward the door in terror. If the guards hear. Let them hear, he said, his voice rising with a sudden, fierce clarity. Let them tell the council that I have made my choice. These children, they are the heirs of the king, but they are our sons in every way that matters. They have thrived because of your heart, not because of a duchess's dowry. I am asking you to stay. Not as a nurse, and not as a shadow hidden in the high tower. He looked up at her, his winter-sea eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that shattered the last of her defenses. Be the mother to these boys. Be the woman who stands at my side when the storms come. Be my Duchess, Elara. Let the court whisper. Let the vipers hiss. I would rather lose the regency than lose the woman who taught me that the realm is worth saving. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the choice. To accept was to step into a different kind of fire, one of judgment, politics, and the endless scrutiny of a world that would hate her for her joy. But as Elara looked down at the man who had been her soldier, her patient, and her secret hope, she realized the chasm between their worlds wasn't made of stone or law. It was made of fear. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced the line of his jaw, mirroring the way she had tended to his fever in the dark. They will never forgive us for this, she whispered. Alistair's smile was grim and beautiful, the look of a man who had finally found his true north. Let them try to stop us. He stood and drew her into his arms, the velvet of his doublet pressing against the wool of her gown. In the cradle, one of the infants stirred, a soft, golden light pulsing momentarily beneath his eyelids as if in approval. The longest night was over, but a new, more dangerous dawn was breaking over the Citadel. The great hall of the Citadel was a cavern of shimmering quartz and cold, unforgiving echoes. Tonight, it was filled with the scent of lilies and expensive musk, a heavy, cloying fragrance designed to mask the lingering smell of stone dust and old ash that still haunted the lower corridors. Elara stood at the top of the marble dais, her hands resting lightly on the velvet railing. She was draped in a gown of midnight blue, the silk so heavy it felt like a suit of armor, cinched at the waist with a belt of hammered silver. Below her, the sea of nobility churned. They were a kaleidoscope of high collars, stiff lace, and eyes that moved with the synchronized precision of sharks circling a wounded prey. To them, she was a scandal in silk, a common girl who had somehow bewitched the High Warden. The whispers were a constant, low-frequency hum, vibrating through the soles of her shoes. They spoke of her lineage, or the lack thereof, and they spoke of the madness that had seized Alistair. Alistair stood a few paces behind her, his presence a steady, radiating heat. He didn't intervene. He had told her that the council would never accept a duchess they could bully, and tonight was her trial by fire. Tell us, Lady Elara, a voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and cold as a winter snap. It was the Dowager Countess of Thorn, a woman whose family had held land since before the first stone of the Citadel was laid. She stepped forward, her fan clicking shut like a finishing stroke. We are told you spent your days in the kitchens and the nurseries. A noble calling for some, no doubt. But the crown of a duchess requires more than the ability to change linens. It requires an understanding of the great balance. How can one who has only ever looked at the floor expect to look toward the horizon? A ripple of cruel laughter followed, stifled behind gloved hands. Elara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, a familiar flare of anger that tasted like the smoke of the burning citadel. She took a breath, and for a moment, the great hall vanished. She wasn't in a palace, she was back in the Blackwood, the freezing sleet hitting the roof, the smell of vinegar and blood in the air, and the weight of two small, divine lives in her arms. She stepped down from the dais, not with the rehearsed glide of a debutante, but with the purposeful, grounded stride of a woman who had walked through the end of the world. The crowd parted, surprised by the directness of her movement. She stopped inches from the countess, who stood her ground, her chin tilted in a mask of hereditary superiority. You speak of the great balance, Countess, Elara said, her voice steady and surprisingly clear, carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. I have seen that balance. I saw it when the Eastern Tower collapsed. It didn't care if the people screaming inside were lords or stable hands. The fire didn't ask for a pedigree before it took their breath. The laughter died. The air in the room seemed to thin. I have looked at the floor, it's true, Elara continued, her gaze unwavering. I looked at it when I was scrubbing the blood of your king from the stone so the heirs wouldn't have to crawl through it. I looked at it when I was tracking an assassin through the mud to keep your future alive. You look toward the horizon and see titles and borders. I look at the people standing on this floor and I see the realm. A crown isn't a prize for having the right ancestors, it's a debt owed to every person who doesn't have the luxury of standing in this hall tonight. She turned her gaze toward the council members, the men who had spent the morning debating alliances and dowries. You want a duchess who knows the dances. I can learn them. But can you learn what it's like to have nothing but your word and a sharp knife between the light and the dark? Because that is what the Aethelgard bloodline was built on. Not silk, but sacrifice. Not bloodlines, but blood spilled in defense of the weak. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of respect, not yet, but it was the silence of recognition. For the first time, the nobility saw not a servant in a stolen dress, but the woman who had held the fragments of their world together when they were all too busy fleeing for their lives. She possessed a gravity that no amount of tutoring could bestow, a grace born of ash and integrity. Alistair stepped forward then, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back. It wasn't a gesture of protection this time, it was a gesture of pride. He looked out at the room, his eyes challenging anyone to speak. No one did. The Countess asks how I can lead, Elara said softly, looking back at the Dowager. I will lead by being fair. Because when you have seen the world burn, you realize that the only thing that survives the fire is the truth of who you were when the smoke was thickest. I am Elara of the Blackwood. And I am exactly what this kingdom needs to remember. She turned and walked back to the dais, her head held high. The smell of the lilies seemed less stifling now, replaced in her mind by the clean, sharp scent of the mountain air. She had not won their love, but she had won their fear, and more importantly, she had won the right to stand beside the man she loved without apologizing for the dirt beneath her fingernails. As they reached the top of the stairs, Alistair leaned in, his voice a low, private murmur. You were magnificent. I was honest, she replied, a small, weary smile finally touching her lips. There's a difference. To them, it's the same thing, Alistair said, his eyes glowing with a fierce, quiet light. And that is why they will never forget tonight.